Hello dear student, welcome to another video in Applied Linguistics. In the previous videos we talked about behaviorism and then nativism. In the same regard, we'll be talking about monitor theory. This theory was proposed by Krashen in 1982. He claims that the best methods to language acquisition are those that supply comprehensible input in low anxiety situations, which allows students to produce when they are ready instead of forcing them to produce. So Krashen here stresses very important ideas. First, we should provide students with comprehensible input. This is the best method to language acquisition. First, comprehensible input. The second thing is low anxiety situations. So where there is no pressure on learners or students, you should feel at ease, okay, so that they can learn or produce very well. Improvements come from supplying communicative and comprehensible input, and not from forcing and correcting productions. So for Krashen, the improvements of learners improve when they are provided by communicative and comprehensible input, and not forcing them, not correcting them. Like you keep correcting them every now and then. This creates some sort of anxiety, okay, pressure on students. Therefore, they feel stressed and they don't produce, they don't improve, etc. Krashen's monitor theory consists of 5 hypotheses. Okay, the acquisition learning hypothesis. There are 2 different ways to develop competence in language: language acquisition and language learning. Language acquisition is a subconscious process. Nobody is aware when it is happening. Language is acquired naturally. Language learning is done in school in a conscious process. Learners are aware of the rules and able to talk about them. Learning is a product of formal instructions. So in this hypothesis, Krashen is distinguishing acquisition from learning. Okay, is making difference between the two. For him, language acquisition is the language that you acquire naturally. That is, it's our mother tongue. That we acquire subconsciously in the street, okay, in society, etc. So there is no structure, there is no formal learning, etc. So we acquire it naturally. And there is language learning, which is done in school, and you are conscious. So you are conscious of the rules, etc. The teacher provides you with lessons, etc., and explains the rules, etc. So you are aware of the rules, and you talk about the rules, etc. Okay, so this kind of learning is the product of formal instructions. So, okay, so in this hypothesis we have acquisition and learning, and they are different according to Krashen. In the second hypothesis, which is called the natural order hypothesis, this hypothesis states that language is acquired in a predictable order. That is, the acquisition of grammatical structures proceeds in a predictable order. You can predict which aspects of language the learner will learn first. This means learners acquire language naturally and not artificially. Okay, and not artificially. You have not there. Okay, so according to this hypothesis, language is acquired in a predictable order. That is, you know which structure, which aspect comes first and which comes later, okay? Which comes next. So we learn simple, for example, simple present at the beginning, then we move, okay, to, for example, present perfect, and then future, perfect, etc. Okay, so the aspects of language are acquired in a certain order, from the simple structure, simple aspect, to the more complex aspect. So we start with the simple, and we move on to the complex structures. That's why it is predictable. You know which comes first. You cannot learn, for example, very complex structures of language first, and then you move on to the simplest. Okay. So the third theory is, or the third hypothesis is the monitor hypothesis. This hypothesis basically attempts to explain how acquisition and learning are used. Okay, according to Krashen, acquirers rely on their tacit knowledge to scan, edit, and correct their acquired knowledge, which is self-correction, whereas learners rely on rules of correctness and they must have time. In the monitor hypothesis, uh, Crusher explains that the difference between not exactly the difference between acquisition and learning, but how these are used. Okay, so according to Crusher, when you're learning your mother tongue, you rely on your tacit knowledge. Okay, the knowledge of your language that you acquired naturally, you rely on it to scan, edit, and correct your language. You correct when you produce a language, you correct yourself. Okay, based on your tacit knowledge. Whereas learners, that is when you are producing a second language, another language, you don't rely on tacit knowledge that you acquired, okay, because you learned language in a formal context, okay, with instructions, etc. So you rely on rules, okay. When you are learning another language, we learn rules, okay. So you rely on rules of correctness to again scan and edit and correct our language. And this takes time, okay. It's not like your mother tongue. You do it quickly. It doesn't take time, okay, because the rules are acquired naturally, okay. But in in L2, okay, second language, this takes time because you rely on rules of correctness and you have to time to time look at the rules if you don't remember them, etc., so that you can develop your language and acquire and produce language, etc. The input hypothesis. This hypothesis attempts to explain how learners acquire second language, okay, through being exposed to comprehensible and varied linguistic input. Learners, L2 learners will develop their competence like L1 acquires. According to Krashen, if you are exposed to comprehensible, communicative, varied linguistic input, you can acquire competence of a native speaker in another language. For example, if you are a native speaker of Arabic, okay, and then you are learning, for example, English, if English is provided to you in a comprehensible input, varied linguistic input, you would acquire the competence of L1 acquires. Okay. Okay. The affective filter hypothesis. This hypothesis suggests that a condition for successful acquisition is that the learner is motivated. This motivation could be intrinsic or extrinsic. If intrinsic, the learner is naturally motivated to learn the language. Attitudes and aptitudes are very crucial in language learning. If extrinsic, the learner is motivated by social factors such as jobs. Okay, so the affective filter hypothesis is basically about motivation. Okay, Question here is the idea that if you want to learn another language, you should be highly motivated. Okay, you should be motivated, otherwise you will not learn the language. You will find it difficult to learn. But if you are motivated, you can learn the language. Okay, and when we talk about motivation, we have two types of motivation. So we have intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is about attitudes. So if we have a good attitude, towards the language you are learning, you are going to learn it very fast, okay? Or extrinsic motivation, which is about a job. For example, if you want to learn another language because you want to be, for example, an English teacher, okay, or a French teacher, or a Spanish teacher. So if you want to be a teacher, that is the motivation. What motivates you to learn that language is that you want to be a teacher in that language. So this kind of motivation also can help you learn another language. So question 1982 has been criticized on the ground that his hypotheses are vague and difficult to investigate empirically. So this is kind of criticism that Krashen had about this hypothesis, about his hypothesis, is that they are vague and they are difficult to investigate empirically. Okay. However, the monetary theory has had a very significant impact on the field of L2 learners. Thank you very much for your attention.